The war had come to an end, yet for many Japanese civilians stranded on the remote Pacific islands, the word end held little meaning. While bombers had ceased their deafening roars and the rattle of naval fire had quieted, the silence that followed was thick with foreboding. For the women in a small village on Saipan, surrender meant something far more frightening. For months, rumors had spread like wildfire. Soldiers fleeing through the jungles whispered warnings. The Americans show no mercy. If they capture you, they'll take everything. Death is better. Propaganda posters echoed the same dark message. The enemy was painted as brutal, dishonorable, and merciless. Mothers told their daughters to hide blades under their clothes. Grandmothers muttered that only death could preserve their honor. So when American patrols finally entered the village, the women huddled together inside a collapsed building, clutching their children to their chests. These were not mythical figures of courage. These were ordinary Japanese women, wives of farmers, widows of soldiers, daughters barely out of their teens. They trembled, hearing the unmistakable sound of boots crunching outside, and foreign voices barking orders they could not understand. The door creaked open. The warm sunlight flooded the dark interior. A tall figure stood in the doorway. A Marine, helmet low, rifle casually slung over his shoulder. Behind him, more soldiers fanned out across the square. The women froze, eyes wide, their bodies pressed tightly against the wall, trying to melt into the wood. The Marine spoke in English, then repeated himself more loudly. No one moved. Finally, with the help of a translator, his message was clear. You are prisoners now. You will not be harmed. Stay together. Food will be provided. The women didn't trust him. Not at first. They stumbled out into the sunlight, blinking as their eyes adjusted. Their kimonos were tattered, stained, their hair a tangled mess from weeks of hiding. Some carried infants, others held the hands of younger children. They expected rough treatment, insults, perhaps even worse. Every fiber of their being screamed that this was the moment they feared, but it didn't come. The soldiers stood still, rifles lowered. They did not approach or touch them. One soldier stepped forward and set a bucket of water on the ground, retreating immediately. Another placed a crate of canned food beside it, prying it open with a knife. The interpreter gestured, "For you, eat." The women stared, uncertain. Could this be some trick? A test of loyalty? Finally, one brave mother bent down, filled a cup with water and drank. The soldiers remained silent. A child reached for the food, and again there was no response, only the stillness of the moment. Slowly, tentatively, they began to eat. For the first time in weeks, broth slid down their throats. Soft bread crumbled in their mouths. Children slurped noisily, their cheeks bulging. Mothers wept, their tears mixing with the taste of the food, and still the Americans remained at a distance. As night fell, the women were led to a makeshift camp at the edge of the village. Blankets were distributed, laid in neat piles. One by one, the women accepted them, expecting the worst, the moment when the soldiers would demand something in return. But it never came. The soldiers stood vigil at the perimeter, their backs half turned, guarding rather than leering. Whispers spread. A young girl, barely 18, asked in a hushed voice, "Why aren't they touching us? Wasn't that what they came for?" Her mother silenced her, but the question lingered in every mind. Inside, relief clashed with confusion. Everything they had been told about the enemy promised violation. Yet here, under strange foreign stars, the Americans treated them with a cold respect. One older woman, Sachiko, clutched her rosary, a hidden relic from her Catholic grandmother. She murmured, "Perhaps their God watches over them." Another scoffed, "Or maybe they're planning to torture us later." But as the hours turned to days, the pattern held. Each morning, food was delivered, water refilled, blankets returned clean. Never once did a soldier cross the invisible line separating them. One evening, as the women sat around a small fire, a Marine approached with a sack. He stopped several paces away, placed it down, and stepped back. Inside were brushes, soap, and small towels. The interpreter spoke slowly. "For washing for you," the women gasped. Some could hardly believe it, too ashamed to take the offerings. But one woman stepped forward, trembling, and took a brush. She dipped it in water and began scrubbing her child's face, removing weeks of grime. The boy laughed, the first sound of joy to pierce the silence in weeks. Again, the soldiers averted their gaze, giving them privacy. That night, Sachiko wrote on a scrap of cloth with charcoal from the fire, "We were ready to die. We thought they would strip us of honor. Instead, they gave us blankets, they gave us food, and never once did they touch us. I don't understand. Perhaps I never will. The shock wasn't in cruelty. It was in the absence of it. In a world ravaged by violence, mercy became the most disorienting weapon of all. For these women, the first days of captivity weren't the nightmare they'd been taught to expect. Instead, it was a fragile mercy that made them question everything they'd been told about enemies, war, and survival. At dawn, the women began their march to the larger camp. They were ordered into a line. Children clutched to their sides, bundles of belongings tied with fraying ropes. Guards walked ahead and behind, rifles at ease, not raised. The women whispered to each other, convinced that their reprieve would end once they reached the garrison. Every step felt like a march toward humiliation. Rumors spread like wildfire. They will take us there. There the officers will make us pay. Mothers steeled themselves, daughters lowered their eyes. But when they arrived, what they found only deepened the confusion. The camp was not a prison. It was a series of wooden barracks, tents, and a Red Cross station with a painted cross. Inside, prisoners were separated. Men in one section, women and children in another. The soldiers handed out more supplies, rice, canned milk, even fruit. The children screamed with joy at the sight of bananas, a rare luxury. Still, the women hesitated. Every kind gesture felt like a trap. One mother whispered, "Wait, they'll take it back when they take us." But the pattern persisted. The Americans gave food and stepped away. They handed out soap and turned their backs. They guided the women to water pumps but always stayed a step behind. Days turned into weeks and still, no one crossed the line they feared most. Then, one afternoon, a medical officer entered the camp with 2 nurses. Through an interpreter, he announced, "We will check the health of mothers and children. If anyone is sick, they will receive medicine." The women froze. Medical care from Americans? Surely this was some trick. But when the officer knelt to examine a sick child, his touch was gentle. He listened to her chest with a stethoscope, muttered instructions, and then handed the mother a small bottle of syrup. The mother wept, bowing low, unable to reconcile mercy with everything she had been taught. Sachiko, the older woman, whispered, "Our own soldiers told us to die before capture, yet here the enemy tells us to live." Another shock came at dusk. A soldier entered the camp with paper and pencils. The interpreter said, "You may write letters to your families. The Red Cross will send them." At first the women stared, stunned. Letters? They had believed themselves cut off, their voices forever silenced. Slowly they took the paper. Hands shook as they wrote, "I am alive. Do not worry." Some simply wrote names, dates, fragments of prayers. A young woman, bent over her page, tears dripping onto the ink. She wrote to her mother in Nagasaki, "I thought I would die in shame, but they have not touched me. They feed us. Perhaps you will see my face again." The letters were collected and carefully folded, placed into a canvas sack. The women watched in silence as it was taken away, unsure if it would ever reach its destination. But the act of writing had lifted something heavy from their hearts. That night, by the dim glow of a lantern, the women spoke softly. Some still insisted it was all a trick, that worse was yet to come. Others, younger, whispered hope. "Maybe they're not like we were told." Ko hugged her knees to her chest, whispering to no one in particular, "I've spent my whole life in fear of men. Tonight I wrote a letter to my mother, and it's more than our own soldiers ever gave us." The Americans continued their strange pattern of restraint. Guards patrolled but never entered the women's quarters without announcing themselves. When blankets became worn, they replaced them. When children cried from fever, medicine appeared, always with the same careful distance, the same refusal to cross the invisible line. This absence became its own presence, gnawing at their beliefs. For years they had been told that the enemy was barbaric, lustful, merciless. Yet here their bodies were untouched, their dignity preserved, their children nourished. Sachiko wrote again on her scrap of cloth, "The greatest shock is not cruelty. It is respect. We thought they would strip us of our honor. Instead, they gave us back our voices. Perhaps this is what mercy truly means." The question among them now was no longer when the abuse would come, but why had it not? And in that silence, in that unbroken boundary, the women began to see their captors not as monsters but as men. Exhausted, weary, human. This realization frightened them more than any brutality ever could. In late summer of 1945, word of Japan's surrender spread across the camps. For the women, the announcement
brought no celebration, only uncertainty. Would they be sent home? Would they stay indefinitely? The Americans offered no immediate answers. They kept to their routine, food at set times, medical visits, guards watching but never intruding. Weeks of captivity had left marks, not of bruises, but of confusion. The women whispered in the dark, admitting what they had dared not say at first. They had not been touched. Not once. No hands reached for them. No soldiers demanded their bodies. No humiliation. The absence of cruelty became the defining memory. Ko, the young woman who had written to her mother, received a letter from the Red Cross. Her letter had been delivered. Tears streamed down her face as she read the reply. Her mother's words trembled with disbelief. "I thought you were dead. Now I know you live. God has answered prayers I dared not speak." Ko clutched the paper to her chest, sobbing. Around her, others gathered, murmuring that if one letter had reached its destination, perhaps theirs had too. Sachiko, the elder, gathered the younger women and said, "We were told that death was better than capture. We were told these men would take us, shame us, strip us. But I tell you this, they did not touch us. They fed us. They guarded us. They gave us our voices." Her words carried the weight of years of fear, dissolving into astonishment. In September, the orders for release came. One by one, the women were escorted to boats that would take them home to Japan. They boarded barefoot, carrying small bundles of belongings. Many carried keepsakes the Americans had given them, a bar of soap, a scrap of cloth, a letter tucked inside their blouse. Ko whispered to her sister, "I'm more afraid to go home than I was to die." The voyage was silent, filled with the scent of salt and the distant cries of gulls. When the women finally set foot on Japanese soil, they were greeted by ruins, flattened cities, broken families, and a nation humbled by surrender. Yet they carried within them a story they struggled to share. How could they explain that the enemy they had been taught to fear had instead given them dignity, not shame? Many stayed silent, fearful of judgment, afraid of being called traitors. But in diaries, in whispered conversations with daughters, the truth endured. Ko wrote in hers, "The Americans did not touch us. That was the greatest shock. For years, we were taught to fear them as monsters. I found men tired of war. Men who chose not to cross the line. That's what I'll carry with me until I die." Sachiko later told her granddaughter, "I prayed with a rosary in my hand, begging to die before dishonor. But when the soldiers came, they gave us blankets and turned away their eyes. That was the day I learned mercy can be more frightening than cruelty, because it makes you question everything you thought you knew." Historians measure wars in numbers, battles, casualties, bombs dropped. But for these women, history was defined by silence. The silence of hands that never reached, of boundaries that never crossed, and of dignity preserved when it was least expected.